I've got to thank Christopher Rufo for this story. This kind of blows my mind. He and Ryan Thorp at the Manhattan Institute and City Journal have this story. If you get the show notes, you can get it. By the way, speaking of, you should text data to 33777 because in a little while I'll be sending out my recipe guide for the holidays, including the gravy recipe. I'm famous for the gravy recipe. You'd be amazed how many people every year email me on Thanksgiving and say, I made your gravy recipe. It was better than mine, because it is. Now, the story. This is Ryan Thorp and Christopher Rufo in City Journal. The largest funder of al-Shabaab, which is a terror group, is the Minnesota Taxpayer. Minnesota is drowning in fraud. Billions in taxpayer dollars have been stolen during the administration of Governor Tim Walz alone. Democratic state officials overseeing one of the most generous welfare regimes in the country are asleep at the switch, and the media, duty-bound by progressive pieties, refuses to connect the dots. In many cases, the fraud has allegedly been perpetrated by members of Minnesota's sizable Somali community. Federal counterterrorism sources confirmed that millions of dollars in stolen funds have been sent back to Somalia, where they ultimately landed in the hands of the terror group al-Shabaab. As one confidential source put it, the largest funder of al-Shabaab is the Minnesota Taxpayer. Our investigation shows what happens when a tribal mindset meets a bleeding heart bureaucracy, where imported clan loyalties collide with a political class too timid to offend, and when accusations of racism are cynically deployed to shield criminal behavior. The predictable result is graft, with taxpayers left to foot the bill. If you were to design a welfare program to facilitate fraud, it would probably look a lot like Minnesota's Medicaid Housing Stabilization Services program. The HSS program, the first of its kind in the country, was launched with a noble goal: help seniors, addicts, the disabled, and the mentally ill secure housing. It was designed with low barriers to entry and minimal requirements for reimbursement. Nonetheless, before the program went live in 2020, officials pegged its annual estimated price tag at $2.6 million. Costs quickly spiraled out of control. In 2021, the program paid out more than $21 million in claims. In the following years, annual costs shot up to $42 million, then $74 million, then $104 million. During the first 6 months of 2025, payouts totaled $61 million. On August 1st, Minnesota's Department of Human Services moved to scrap the program, noting that payments to 77 housing stabilization providers had been terminated this year due to credible allegations of fraud. Joe Thompson, then the acting U.S. Attorney for the District of Minnesota, went even further, stating that the vast majority of the HSS program was fraudulent. On September 18th, Thompson announced criminal indictments for HSS fraud against Mokhtar Hassan Aden, Mustafa Dayib Ali, Khalid Ahmed Dayib, Abdifta Mahmoud Mohammed, Christopher Ejisoji Faladi, Emmanuel Oluwadamalaki Falad, Assad Ahmed Adal, and Anwar Ahmed Adal, 6 of whom, according to the U.S. Attorney's spokesman, are members of Minnesota's Somali community. Thompson made clear that this is just the first round of charges. What were they doing? This is kind of funny to me. Many of the people were getting their kids classified as having severe autism, getting payments from the system, and then rerouting that money, carrying it on board airplanes, flying it to Somalia, and handing it to the terrorists. In a press release announcing indictments, U.S. Attorney made clear the alleged autism fraud scheme extended to a wide network of people. To drive up enrollment, Hassan and her partner paid monthly cash kickback payments to the parents of children who enrolled. These kickback payments ranged from $300 to $1,500 per month per child. The amount of these payments was contingent on the services DHS authorized a child to receive. The higher the authorization amount, the higher the kickback. Often, parents threaten to leave and take their children to other autism centers if they didn't get paid higher kickbacks. Much like with the HSS program, autism claims to Medicaid in Minnesota have skyrocketed in recent years, from $3 million in 2018 to $54 million in 2019, $77 million in 2020, $183 million in 2021, $279 million in 2022, and $399 million in 2023. Meantime, the number of autism providers in the state has spiked from 41 to 328. Many of them in the Somali community establishing their own autism treatment centers, citing the need for culturally appropriate programming. By the time the fraud scheme was exposed, 1 in 16 Somali 4-year-olds in the state had reportedly been diagnosed with autism, a rate more than triple the state average. And then what were they doing? They were literally taking the payments, literally putting the cash in suitcases, and flying to Somalia to hand the cash to al-Shabaab, the terrorist group. This is wild to me. The total costs ran to billions of taxpayer dollars. This again, reading from the City Journal. The Somali fraud rings have sent huge sums in remittances or money transfers from Minnesota to Somalia. An estimated 40% of households in Somalia get remittances from abroad. In 2023 alone, the Somali diaspora sent back $1.7 billion, more than the Somali government budget for the year. Our investigation reveals that some of this money has been directly linked to the al-Qaeda Islamic terror group al-Shabaab. According to multiple law enforcement sources, Minnesota's Somali community has sent untold millions through a network of hawalas, informal clan-based money traders who wound up in the coffers of al-Shabaab. According to Glenn Kearns, a retired Seattle police detective who spent 14 years on the Federal Joint Terrorism Task Force, the Somalis ran a sophisticated money network spanning from Seattle to Minneapolis and were routing significant amounts of cash on commercial flights from the Seattle airport to the Hawala networks in Somalia. One of the networks, Kearns discovered, spent $20 million abroad in a single year. A staggering amount of money, Kearns said. I worked on it for 5 years. We had sources going into the Hawalas to send money. I went down to Minnesota and pulled all their records, and well, blankety blank, all these Somalis sending out money are on DHS benefits. How does that make sense? We all had good sources telling us it's welfare fraud. Kearns investigated the Hawalas in Somalia that were receiving the money transfers. He determined through human sources the significant funds were being sent to al-Qaeda's al-Shabaab network. Y'all, the good intentions of progressives. I want to be really nuanced here. There are people on social media on the right now who are trying to stir everyone up online right now about Muslim immigration to the United States. Unlike them, I grew up in the Middle East. I have many Muslim friends who would fit in your neighborhood. There are real concerns, however, about a growing trend led by the left to immigrate people to the United States who have no intention of integrating into American society. They don't want to give up their clannish ways from their homes, their tribal ties. They don't want to be American. They just want to live off of America. And many of them are indoctrinated with the idea that we owe it to them because of colonialism and past wars, and they're here to live off the system. They're not here to be Americans. I want a Muslim to come to the United States who wants to be American. I do not want a Muslim to come to the United States and decide that his ties to his culture and homeland are paramount to being an American. It means something to be an American, and you should assimilate into being an American. That doesn't mean giving up your religion. What it does mean is that the conquesting ways of Islam in Arabia cannot be the same thing here in the United States. What it means for the Somalis is that when you come to the United States, You integrate into an American community and you start eating tacos and hamburgers and everything else. You enjoy pizza and you become an American. You learn to speak the language and you integrate into society. That's not happening, particularly in a place like Minnesota under Tim Walz, where the Somalis stay in Somali communities with Somali clan tribal loyalties. The Somalis hate each other based on those clan tribal loyalties. They have no desire or interest to actually be Americans. They want to be Somalis in America. I have a real problem with any group of people doing this. I would have a problem if it were a group of Frenchmen who came to the United States and wanted to set up a French colony in the United States. They didn't want to be English. They didn't want to speak English. They didn't want to have anything to do with English. I'd go in and buy my bread and cheese, and otherwise I'd want them all deported because they don't want to be Americans. They want to live off the system. Claiming, you Americans, you owe us for a revolution. No, we don't owe you a thing. Integrate, assimilate, be American. It doesn't matter whether they're white, black, brown, red, yellow, black, or white. I don't care. You assimilate into the United States. And these communities in Minnesota, they're taking advantage of progressivism and the progressive white guilt of the liberals in Minnesota, and they're funding terrorists who want to kill the Americans. Kudos to Chris Rufo and Ryan Thorp for exposing this in City Journal. And again, if you text data to 33777, you can get the show notes and you can read this whole article for yourself. It's not behind a paywall. And it really is a must-read article that this is happening in Minnesota. And here's the other thing you need to know. Where is ABC News? CBS News? ABC, more Americans get their news from ABC News than any other source. Where are you, ABC? Why aren't you covering this? Barry Weiss at CBS, this is a great story for 60 Minutes to cover. See, the problem here is that because City Journal is run by the Manhattan Institute, which is right of center, a lot of the left will ignore this to their peril and ours. If you want to be dismissive of funding terror, don't be dismissive of the massive amounts of fraud. You have an entire network of Somali immigrants to Minnesota living in a Somali ghetto, essentially, in Minnesota, refusing to integrate, but they've decided if we diagnose our children as autistic, we'll get money. And some of those people are like, hey, and we can fund terrorists in Africa who are killing American soldiers. This is how a great nation commits suicide. I have real concerns about some of the people I see online trying to stir up animosity towards Muslims in America. I actually do, because I think they're overplaying their hand. There are concerns, and they're painting with such a broad brush, it's going to make it very easy for people to dismiss the real concerns, and there are real concerns. But I abhor the people who can see a story like this and say, well, that's Chris Rufo. I'm going to ignore the story. You shouldn't ignore the story. You ignore the story at your own peril. The largest funder of al-Shabaab is the Minnesota Taxpayer, according to one source to City Journal. Millions of dollars are flowing from American taxpayers who live in Minnesota to Somalia to fund terrorism around the world, not just in Africa. And the American Press Corps will yawn and move on. You know, one of the greatest issues with bias in the media is what they refuse to cover. I've said that a number of times. When I was at CNN for a number of years before I moved over to Fox, I was oftentimes required to comment on stories that originated on left-wing websites. I cannot remember a single time I was required to comment on a story that originated on a right-wing site. And I had that conversation with an editor at CNN one time. They said, well, the right doesn't do news like the left. That's why. And I said, baloney. Well, I didn't say baloney. I said something close to baloney. Started with the B. And went through a series of stories that were being conducted by Andrew Breitbart at the time and by others, all investigative pieces by the right. And this editor at CNN had no idea. No idea. And finally established if there's a big story, I think, send it to them. And they'll vet it. And still, even when I did, they oftentimes came up with excuses to dismiss it. Will CNN do a story on the Minnesota taxpayers who are funding terrorism without even knowing it? MSNBC surely won't. Will CNN? Will PBS? Will the New York Times? This is a well-documented, well-researched, and well-sourced story, and it should get wider exposure and not just live on the conservative sphere of things because conservatives came up with it. And part of the problem for the press is that's what they like to do, and maybe Bari Weiss at CNN can change that, or CBS can change that.